There's peaks and valleys in life. Life is full of peaks and valleys. Peaks and valleys. Do we like these peaks and valleys? Not always. Not always. Which takes us to the story of a man named Job from the land of Uz, who was looked at as a very upright man, perfect in his ways. But he had one nagging issue. He was afraid that he would lose everything. In his fear of losing everything, this created some valleys, because he was at the peak of society. He was on the mountaintop. Job, he was on the mountaintop, spelled J-O-B. He was on the mountaintop. Job, right? It's spelled just like job, because the peaks and valleys of life, that's your job to experience that. And just by existing, for the most part, you experience that. Just by existing, you kind of sign up for this peaks and valleys type of life. It's like, man, just by me being born, I got ups and downs. So you have people who like will check out of that. Unfortunately, and there's, that may be a trigger. So just be mindful of people giving up on the idea, knowing that life is peaks and valleys. So in Job's story, if you're not familiar with it, the devil joined the host of heaven to just check out things. And the Lord asked him, what have you been up to, Satan? He said, I'm just going to and fro, back and forth, up and down, right? And he said, have you considered my servant Job? And then Satan was like, not only did I consider him, I can't even touch him. You won't let me touch him. You won't let me do anything to him. Yeah, I've been considering him for the longest, but I can't break through his righteousness. I can't, the boundaries is too strong around him. But if you would lift and just allow me to do this, that, and the third to him, I bet you he'll turn on you. Peaks and valleys. So a person listens to this and looks at this and says, I don't want any part of that. Peaks and valleys. Well, then you don't want any part of life, because life has peaks and valleys. And, before we look at the peaks and valleys thing as a negative, as, there's always something type of energy, consider this. When you look at an EKG, a heart monitor, you see the line, right? Well, that line going up and down is signs of life. We want things to be peaceful for the most part naturally. Don't we all want that? We want life to be perfect. There's nothing wrong with wanting life to be perfect. Go ahead and want life to be perfect, because truth be told, if you're accepting certain things as they are and you're looking for the perfection in things versus the imperfection of things, life will become more perfect. So if you keep your eyes on the idea of perfection as something to enjoy rather than something to try and force, perfection will come. And life will have many more peaks that will be higher than the valley depths. So Job, after being on this peak, enters this valley where Satan is taking things from him, taking away his livestock, taking away his family, finally taking away his health, but couldn't take away his life. That's the only thing he couldn't take. He couldn't take away his life, because the peaks and valleys are the signs of life. If Satan were to kill Job, according to the story, if Satan would have killed Job, the peaks and valley experience would end, which means there's no signs of life. The EKG would have been a flat line. It would have been a flat line if Satan would have killed Job. It would have been a flat line if Satan would not have even tested him in the first place. Yeah, he was on a peak, but with no valleys, it's still a flat line at a higher elevation. A flat line is death. That's what a flat line is. But when we say things like peace be still, we don't see that as death, but it is. Peace be still, and the storm stops and The ocean becomes smooth as glass. The line becomes flat. Yeah, that's death to the anxiety. That's death to having an anxious spirit. That's death to worry. That's death to depression. That's death to fear of submersion, fear of failure. That's a death. So in this Job story, and when you line it up with the EKG and Satan's test of providing the counterbalance of valleys to go with Job's peaks, you have a very lively story, because the average person won't read the story that starts off happily and then ends happily ever after. It's just going to look like a showroom floor. You know, we're just celebrating somebody's life and accolades. There's a place for that, but it doesn't create a compelling story. You have to have an antagonist. You have to have these challenges that makes the story worth reading, that makes the life worth living. Do I agree to this? Absolutely not. But is it the truth? Absolutely. Yeah, I don't agree that life has to have peaks and valleys. I don't agree. But just because I don't agree doesn't make it untrue. It's still true that life has peaks and valleys, whether I agree with it or not. It's still the truth. So, you have in Job's story, long story short, in regards to his story with the peaks and valleys, he gets double for everything he lost because he held on. But in this holding on, he was honest, and he explored every single peak, valley also that he had. But his fear of valleys and valley moments manifested those valleys. Now, had this not been something that hounded Job's mind, and here's how you know that it hounded Job's mind, because in that text it talks about Job getting up every day to make sacrifices for his children, assuming that they sinned in some way that would be deserving of death. He would be under this assumption daily. And so if you're assuming something is bad, you will eventually lose it. God will eventually take it away from you. So he's like, I got to do all these sacrifices for these kids. I got to do all these sacrifices every morning. And nothing said whether or not the kids were unruly or not. Job was just assuming that. But because Job was a righteous man, without God putting the kids' business in the street, you know, he probably had some credence to that, to assume that. But either way, it hounded his mind enough where he manifested that. And Satan happened to be the agent to install the valleys. So in exploring the valleys, this is how you get to a scripture that says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of what? Death. I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. That's the EKG monitor going back up. Like beep, beep. It goes down when he says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. That's the EKG line pointing down. But then he says, but thou art with me, for thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Now the EKG goes back up from a valley to a peak. You see that? Keep this in mind also in day-to-day applications of wisdom. Keep in mind this in regards to this story. If you're having too many back-to-back peak and valley moments, it represents an erratic heartbeat and an out-of-control spiked heart rate. The doctors are usually rushing, scrambling around you with things to poke you with. If your thing is looking like a doggone, like you fell in a doggone polygraph, if your heart rate is jacked up like that, you be careful, because erratic lifestyles are real. You have people who have so many peaks and valleys so close together that you really can't survive at that pace. It's exciting for a while, it's exhilarating, but imagine if you couldn't slow your heart rate down. That's a person who lives impulsively. It's like a person who can't catch their breath because they're breathing too hard. They're working, you know what I mean? They're going through too much. Too many peaks and valleys close together. It starts to drain you of your life force, because it takes so much effort out of the person to be going through those experiences like that. Oh, here's a high peak, here's a high valley. Peaks and valleys like days apart, weeks apart. It just ends up being too much. And likewise, with no peaks or valleys, it goes back to the flat line. Person like, yeah, I had one peak and one valley. You know, and I'm not saying go out here and be a thrill seeker to seek peaks and valleys just for the sake of acquiring life experience either. You go at your own pace. But if the colors of life should ever fade and you go from Technicolor back to black and white and you're thinking, you're gonna have to, maybe if you prefer it, you will probably have to have more peaks and valleys on your EKG monitor. Because what does the EKG represent in your heart? Your life force, right? That's why the line is green for the heart. The heart chakra is green. So is the line on the EKG monitor. It's green. And it measures what? Your heart. So what do the peaks and valleys measure? Your heart. It monitors how you're receiving things, how you respond to things, how you take things, how you initiate things, how you maintain, how you juggle in this struggle. It's all on a divine EKG monitor known as your life, known as your heart, known as your soul, known as your entries into the Akasha, your books in your section of the Nagamati library, your part, your paragraph, your page, your chapter in the Lamb's Book of Life. So manage these things, peaks and valleys. Have enough of them where you can catch your breath and you can breathe easy. Super T Sigma, Sigma programming. Stay illuminated, people. Peace.